I never thought I would find myself in this position, sitting across from my husband's boss, my hands rapid errand, a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, my heart pounding so hard. I could hear it in my ears, the words Ehad just spoken lingered in. The air between us thick and heavy, changing everything. I thought I knew about my marriage, my husband, and the life we had built together over the past 35 years. But let me back up a little. My name is Diane. I'm 59 years old and foremost of my adult life. I've been happily married to Richard, a man I once believed was my perfect match. We met in Khaled's, married young, and built a life together. As in 2 children and weathering the storms that inevitably come with a long-term relationship. Richard had always been a hard worker devoted to providing for our family, and while our marriage was perfect, I had never once doubted his loyalty or the foundation we had built. That all changed the night of the campaign. Kayla, it was one of those extravagant corporate events that Richard's company hosted once a year, lavish dinners, flowing champagne, and speeches that went on far too long. I had attended dozens of these over the years, Louise playing the supportive wife, smiling politely at people I barely knew, while Richard shook hands and topped business. But this year was different. There was a shift in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the way people looked at me, pitying, curious, almost hesitant. Or maybe it was way Richard himself seemed distant. They had always been charismatic at this events, but that night he seemed preoccupied, distracted. His smile forced. I had planned to ignore it, to push aside the gnawing unease in my gut until Richard's boss, Alan Whitmore, pulled me aside. Alan was in his early 60s, a well-respected man with salt and pepper hair and an air of quiet authority. We had always been cordial, exchanging pleasantries at these events, but we'd never had a conversation beyond the usual small talk that night. However, he looked at me with something different in his eye, something almost like a regret. Diane, he said, his voice low, would you mind stepping outside with me for a moment? There's something I need to talk to you about. I hesitated, glancing around their room. Richard was deep in conversation with a group of executive, lung at some joke I hadn't heard hard for a brief second. I wondered if had noticed that his boss was pulling away, but he never even looked in mid-erection. I followed Alan out onto the balcony, where the cool night air rapid us, a stark contrast to the warmth of the room. The city stretched out before his, lights twinkling against the dark sky. Bet could hardly appreciate the view. Me nerves were wonged. What is this about, Felon? I asked me. Voice steady, despite the unease creeping into my chest. He exhaled, slowly rubbing the back of his neck as if searching for the right words. Diane, I wouldn't be telling you this if I didn't think you had a right-o. No, and I need you to understand. I'm not trying to interfere in your marriage, but I can't keep quiet about this anymore. My stomach clenched. Keep quiet about what? Alan hesitated, then met my gaze with a solemn expression. Richard has been keeping something from you, something big. World seemed to tilt slightly beneath me. I gripped the railing, McKnuckles white. Alan, if you have a something to say, just say it. He sighed-a-thon, spoke the words that would unravel everything. I know about her. For a moment he couldn't process what he means. Words felt foreign, disjointed, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together. But then, as the silence stretched between us, realization dawned. No, I said automatically, shaking me head. You're mistaken. Alan looked at me with something like sympathy. I wish I were. I felt the ground slip away beneath my breath, hitched. And for a second, I thought I might collapse. Who? The question barely escaped the lips. He hesitated, then said her name. I recognized a name that shattered the illusion I had held. On 2 decades, I didn't cry. Not then, not in front of Alan. I simply turned and walked away, my mind spinning, my heart hammering by the time. I found Richard inside the ballroom. He was still awing with his colleagues, a glass of whiskey in his hand, as if the world hadn't just shifted beneath my feet. And in that moment, standing there in my elegant evening gown, surrounded by laughter and music, I realized something terrifying. I didn't know the man I had married, and I wasn't sure If I ever had a don't remember how I made it through the rest of the gala, everything felt like a blur, the clinking of glasses. Thelo, no hum of conversation, the occasional bursts of laughter that felt so distant, so disconnected from the cow's raging. Inside me, I kept my face composed, my expression neutral, but beneath the surface, I was unraveling. Richard was completely oblivious. He smiled, he networked, he medaced rounds like the perfect executive while I stood there drowning in technology. Alan had just given me there was another woman. I kept stealing glances at Richard, searching for something, guilt, hesitation, a flicker of recognition that he knew what I now knew. But there was nothing. He was as smooth as ever, and that realization installed me even more. If he had been hiding this, how long had he been dwindled? And how could I have been sublime? The drive home was painful as lant. Richard, slightly buzzed from the whiskey, was in high spirits, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel. As I didn't have a care enthralled, I sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the dark road, my mind spinning with 1,000 questions. Finally, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I spoke with Alan tonight. I said, my voice carefully controlled. Richard chuckled. Yeah, he's a good guy, can be a little intense, but he means well. It turned to look at him, searching for any sign of unease. He told me some Athenian touristing. That was the moment his finger stilled on the wheel. It was brief, just a half-second pause. But I caught it. What's that? He asked. Is tone casual, too casual? I swallowed hard. He said he knows about her for the first time that night. He saw it. The crack in his perfect fidette was subtle, just a small shift in Heist's expression. But it was there. His jaw tensed. His grip on the wheel tightened, and for a fleeting moment I saw some of them flicker in Heist's face. He exhaled sharply through his noseathon, let out a forced chuckle. Alon's always been a bit of a gossip. You know how these office rumors get. Didn't do that? Richard, my voice was steadier than I expected. Don't brush this off. I need to know the truth. He sighed, rubbing his temple as if this conversation was an inconvenience. Diane, come on. We've been married for 35 years. Do you really think I would do something like that? That was the moment something inside messed up. Would you? My voice? Harper, now laced with something I hadn't felt in a long time. Injure. Because right now I don't know what to think. I don't know what to believe. But I do know that Alan wouldn't they've pulled me aside unless he had Adam Gudrison. Richard's lips pressed into Athen line. His silence spoke louder than words. The rest of the drive home was suffocating. When we pulled into the driveway, I got out of the car before he even turned off the engine. I walked straight into the house, my heels clicking against the tile floor as I made my way to the kitchen. I needed something to hold on to, something solid, something real. I poured myself a glass of water, but my hands were shaking. Too much to take a sip. A moment later, Richard stepped into the kitchen, his face drawn, his eyes darker than before. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. You really want to do this now, Heask? I let out a bitter laugh. No, it shored. I'd rather wait until our 40th anniversary dinner to discuss your affair. He flinched just slightly. But I caught it. Who is she? My voice was quiet but firm. He looked away, staring at the marble countertop as if the answer were carved into the stone. Diane, he sighed. It's not what you think. I slammed my glass down. Then tell him what it is, because right now it looks an awful lot like my husband has been lying to me. The silence stretched between us. Then finally he spoke. It's complicated. I let out a hollow laugh. Oh, he bet it is. He ran a hand through his hair, looking more exhausted than I had ever seen him. She's someone I work with. Heishnot. It's not an affair, not in the way I'm thinking. I repeated, my voice shaking. Then tell me, Richard, how should he be thinking about it? He hesitated, and that hesitation cut deeper than anything's else. Never meant for it to happen, Hefele said. It wasn't planned. It just happened there. It was the confirmation. A cold, sharp pain settled in my chest, one that I knew would take a long time to fade. How long? I asked, barely recognizing my own voice. Richard inhaled deeply, then exhaled. About a year, but year, an entire year of deception, an entire year of him coming home to me sitting across from me. At the dinner too, kissing me goodnight, all Willie another woman existed in the spaces. Between tears pricked at my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Who is she? I asked again. Richard's shoulders sagged. Her name is Julia. Julia the name, echo Wedden. My mind foreen, yet familiar, I knew that name. She had been at the gala tonight, I had seen. Her a younger woman, mid-40s, attractive in a polished profession way. I had even complimented her dress, and all the while she had been sleeping with Maya's band. I took a deep breath, gripping edge of the counter to steady myself. Do you love her, Richards? Head snapped up, his eyes wide. Fan. Come on, I love you. I've always loved you. But you wanted her. He didn't answer, didn't have to. The truth was already there, hanging in the space between use impossible toigner. I turned away, feeling something inside me shift. Smith and Reversal. I had spent 35 years building a life with this man, believing in the foundation we had created, and now in the span of one night, that foundation had cracked beneath my feet, and for the first time in my life, I didn't. No. I fit Cabrera paired. The silence between us fell thievier than words could ever be through it, of his confession pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I had spent 35 years loving this man, trusting him, believing that what we had was solid and shackle. And yet here we were. Richard shifted his weight, exhaling through his nose as if bracing himself for another round of questions. But I had none left, at least not in Fatment. I turned away from him, my hands gripping the cool marble of the kitchen counter. I could hear his breathing bend me, unsteadying so. It struck me how unfamiliar thought it was. Richard was always so sure, of himself, always so in control. Ian, please, he started, his voice softer no. I closed my eyes. I need some air, without waiting for his response. He grabbed my coat and walked out the back door. The night was cold, but a welcome at the sharp chill against my skin, rounded me, kept me from dissolving into the storm of emotions. Rajan inside. I stepped onto the patio, staring out at the garden. Richard and I had tended together for years. The hydrangea had long since lost their bloom, their dried petal rustling in the wind. A single porch light cast a golden glow across the yard, illuminating the familiar, yet suddenly foreign space. How many nights had I stood hurrah, completely unaware of the other life he was leading, footsteps behind me? I didn't turn. I never wanted to hurt you, Richard said quietly. I let out a bitter laugh. Eel ways were good with words. A pause. It wasn't about replacing you, Diane. I turned, then my arms crossed against the cold. Then what was it, Abutrachard, tell me? Because I'm dying to understand. He hesitated, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked older than he had. Just hours ago, I don't know, admitted he. Wish I had a better answer, but I didn't. It just happened. I shook me head. No, Richard, it didn't just happen. You made a choice. You made hundreds of choices over the past year. Every text, every lie, every moment you spent with her. That was a choice. He flinched at my words, but didn't argue. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the tremble in my voice. Did you ever think about me, Abutis? His eyes darkened with regret. Of course. I did, every single day. Then why wasn't that enough? Richard swallowed hard. I don't know. The wind carried the silence between us, rebengaring me like an unwanted embrace. I turned my gaze back to the yard. Alan told me something else that nitriched, stiffened. What I hesitated, if I said it out loud, it would make it real. But then again, it was already real. Said, she's pregnant. The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet as I spoke the words. Richard's face went completely still. Thecla drained from his skin, and that wassail, the confirmation. I needed a sharp breath, escaped my lips, and I covered my mouth with my hand as if that could somehow hold back the tidal wave of paint that crashed over me. Oh my God, it whispered, it's true. Richard's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Thi gnome voice was raw, broken. Don't say nothing, not right now. I took a step back, putting space between us, because I knew needed it, because if I let him come any closer, I wasn't sure what I would owe. Richard looked like he wanted Torg to plead, to reach for me. But hadn't maybe he knew this was the moment where words wouldn't fix anything. Tears burned my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I need to be alone, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't stop me as I turned and walked inside. Didn't stop walking until I reached a door. Bedroom, the room we had shared for over 3 decades, the room that suddenly felt like a stranger's. I shut the door behind Mep, appering my back against it as their reality of everything settled in. Mika's band had betrayed me. And now another woman was carrying his child, and I had an idea what to do next. I don't know how long I stood there, my back pressed against the door, my breath coming in slow, measured gasps. My mind was a blur, me emotions tangled in knots to titanity for 35 years. Richard had been my husband, my constant, my safe place, and in no night that foundation had cracked, revealing the fragile ground beneath. But what shook me the most wasn't just the betrayal. It was the undeniable truth that my life was a Budo change forever. He finally moved, stepping toward the bedway had shared for decades. The sheets were still pulled back from the night before, the impression of his body faint but visible. I ran my fingers along the fabric, feeling its softness, its warmth. It had always been my sanctuary bed. Now it felt for, and a quiet knock at the door. I didn't answer. A few seconds passed and then Richard's voice came through, as sittin' and thick with emotion. Diane, can we talk? I took a steadying breath. I wasn't tready, but I also knew I couldn't hide forever. Slowly I crossed the room and opened the door. Richard stood there, his face weary, his shoulders heavy with guilt. In his hands was a small old photo of us on our wedding day. I never stopped loving you, he said softly. I looked at the picture, the phrase, an image of 2 people so full of love from eyes. I almost didn't recognize the monomer. I exhaled, shaking my head. If you loved me, why wasn't I? Tono has swallowed. I wish I had an answer that won't make this hurt less, but I toned. A lump formed in my throat. She's pregnant, Richard. That's not something we can just move past. He nodded, his eyes filled with something that almost looked like fear. I know. Silence stretch had bet Weenus thick with the weight of everything's up. Finally I spoke the words that had been sitting on my tongue since I heard's truth. What do you want to do? His expression shifted, uncertain, regret, maybe even grief. I don't know, he admitted. I let out a bitter laugh. Well, Ito, reach us deepened in. No, interrupted I, deserve better than this. I deserve better than a husband who doesn't. No. If he wants me, or the woman carrying his child. Pain flashed across his face. But I didn't let it soften me. For 35 years I've stood by you. I've loved you. You've a sacrificed for you, and this is what I get. In return, my voice broke. But I didn't stop. I won't beg you to love me, Richard. I won't fight for someone who didn't fight for me. His lips parted. Asif. He wanted to argue, but I saw it in his eyes. He knew I was right. I squared me shoulders, standing taller than space. I had an hours. I need space and I need time. But most of all, I need respect, Andy. Won't stay where I'm not valued. Tears welled in his eyes, but nodded. I understand. I stepped back, gripping the edge of the door. Then I think you should leave it on it. His face twisted with emotion, but he didn't fight me. He just gave Asmel nod, then turned and walked away. I closed the door behind him. A strange thing happened for the first time that night. I didn't feel like I was drowning. I felt like I could finally breathe. Months passed. Richard moved into a small apartment across town. The divorce papers were filed, and though it hurt God, it hurt. I knew it was the right decision. There were nights when loneliness crept in, whispering doubts into Tamir. But those nights grew fewer, and the mornings came brighter. I rebuilt myself piece by piece, started taking long walks, reading books I had once set aside, reconnecting with friends I had neglected in the hazy of marriage, and slowly I found something I hadn't realized I had lost myself, because at the end of it, Allie wasn't just Richard's wife. I was Deanna, and that was enough.